Good morning, everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Lovely to see so many of you with us. A very, very nice April weather at long last. So lovely to see so many of us in the room. Welcome to the Social Housing Roundtable, particularly if this is your first event. A huge welcome to the community and obviously to everyone who's been with us for a while. A massive welcome back. It's lovely to see so many of you with us here today already. My name's Matt Baird. I am the founder, host, and chair of the Social Housing Roundtable. I've been running this now for about 4 years. The first sessions were about 5 years ago, almost exactly, as we went into the pandemic and everything else that happened through 2020. But really, for the last 4 years, this is something that has grown, has developed, has built, and we do this every single week, every Tuesday at 11 o'clock, with the exception, advance warning of next week, where there won't be one because I've been asked to go to a wedding. So unfortunately, there won't be a session next week, and I figure that's about as good an excuse I can possibly get. The Social Housing Roundtable is here to generate conversation, and you'll have seen from the tagline on the page that we've created and on our artwork, it's creating conversations from the communities that matter. And the idea behind this so much, and something I'm really passionate about, is I want people to come in and I want people who, if you do disagree, to be able to voice this in respectfully, but in a place where you can disagree, where you can have a discussion, where you can really understand both sides of the coin. Because too often we speak into our own echo chambers, too often we hear just what we want to hear. But more importantly, we don't get to actually hear what the other side is all about, which is why this is such a phenomenal group that's grown. We have chief execs, we have tenants, we have out of sector consultants, we have everybody in between. And within that group, this is a place where I'd like to hope voices are heard and are valued and are believed. So if this is your first session, or if you've been coming to a number of them, if you've not had the chance to speak up, we want to hear from you. And again, we welcome you hugely. Day to day, I work in recruitment. That's what keeps this running for free. So if you are looking for any recruitment support, please do reach out. Your money does genuinely keep this running for free for everybody. So a huge thank you to everyone who has used me for those methods. But also a big, big thank you to both Alertical and CMSG, who are sponsoring this through 2025 going into 2026. So on to today. As a few of you will recall, if you were here with us last year, we had the Chartered Institute of Housing came along and ran a few different sessions for us, usually around consultations, to be honest with you. We put them at the beginning of the year and then found there were so many consultations coming on. That's where we kind of focused through the year. And they were brilliant and they were really interesting and they really generated conversation and discussion. However, this year, what we're seeing is the implementation of a lot of the things that we last year had consultation about. And I reached out to the CIH and said, hi, do you want to come back? Would you like to do a session this year? Because they always landed well and we always had a lot of interesting debate. And through Rachel and the team, they went, would Eve come on? Would you welcome Eve to the session to talk about the actual implementation of Awaab's law, what's going to be going on with it, what we're hearing about how it might actually come to fruition, but more importantly, what it's going to be like for housing providers to really have to grasp with something that was absolutely needed and morally is absolutely the right thing to be doing, but financially is actually quite a difficult thing sometimes to implement, and where we are between those two things. So it is my absolute privilege to welcome Dr. Eve Blezard with us today. I'm going to pass over to Eve to discuss and kick off today's discussion to those who are new. While Eve is talking, please feel free to put questions, thoughts, ideas, brain thoughts in general into the chat. We want to be hearing them. We want to hear what you're thinking. Eve will speak for about 20 minutes or so, and then we will move into a more open forum discussion where I'm going to invite people to come in and share their thoughts and ideas. So, I'm just going to mute there. I'll pass over to you, and a huge welcome to the Social Housing Roundtable.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you for letting me be here today. I do have a few slides to share, but I thought before I did share those, I thought, because they sort of dominate the screen, don't they? I thought I would say hello. For anyone that doesn't know me, get a chance to see my face for a little bit. I think what I will do is start with a caveat that I am not here with a magic solution or sort of special government secrets into what's going on. But what I am going to do is sort of walk us through where we are, some of those challenges that Matt just talked about, but some very practical solutions to how we can work together as a sector, really, and respond in a way that really sort of places not just safety, but also dignity and resident voice. Because I'm pretty confident this will affect everybody in a room today. So the real question is, what's next? Where do we go? So the three main things that I wanted to sort of quickly cover today, and then hopefully explore in a bit more depth when we get into some conversation, is a very quick recap of what the law is and just where that sits in terms of the wider regs. Some of those very practical challenges and realities that we need to be ready for to be able to implement the law. But then I wanted to have a look at some practical sort of evidence-based solutions, if you will, not necessarily in terms of specifically looking at meeting the law, but some of that wider work on how do we drive quality forward and what that looks like. So I'm going to do the usual share my screen. Can you see that?
Just loading. Hopefully we'll see it in just a sec. Yes, we can. Fantastic.
Brilliant. Right. Okay, so for anyone that doesn't know me, hello. I'm Eve. I've been working in the sector now for about 15 years. I was just saying to Matt, they did let me escape briefly, and I went into academia, and I fled. I came back into the open arms of housing. I couldn't cope not working in housing, and primarily I have a background in community development and tenant voice. And at the moment, I am the policy lead for the Chartered Institute's work on asset management, building safety, and culture. And we'll get into why culture's on the end. So before we go any further, I really felt that before I spoke about anything else, it was very important to pay our respects to our Bishak and his family. For anyone that isn't aware, Awaab was only 2 years old when he died in 2020 from prolonged exposure to mould in his social home. In November 2022, there was a coroner's prevention of future death reports, and that led to government commitment to change. And Awaab's law, I say is, we're not quite there yet, but will be part of the Social Housing Regulation Act of 2023. So it will set legally binding timeframes for landlords to investigate and repair what the law refers to as serious hazards. And when we say hazards, we are looking at Cat 1 hazards from HSSRS. As Matt was saying, so the last time we will have been here, there will have been lots of consultation about this. And since then, we've managed to move through 2 governments and multiple different ministers. And we did have a ministerial statement earlier this year that did confirm both the timescales, but phasing of the law. And also being open to, I think, what's referred to as sort of a learning approach. So the law will come into force in October 2020, and initially we will see that damp and mould. And ultimately, and probably everybody already knows this because we've been waiting for so long, landlords will have 14 days to investigate hazards, and where the hazards pose a significant risk, repairs must be made within 7 days, apart from emergency repairs. Now, it does say that emergency repairs must be done within 24 hours, but I think that is really more about making safe within that 24 hours. And then on top of that, landlords will need to provide a written summary of their findings within 48 hours of the investigation. So it is very time bound. It's quite a list of different times to sort of push that work to be done a lot more quickly. We will start with damp and mould, and then we will enter what is expected to be a learning phase over the rest of this year and next year. And I think that's very much about the sector and residents being open with officials about how does that go, reviewing early cases. And then we are expecting to see a full rollout to all the Cat 1 hazards apart from overcrowding by the end of 2027. And that's a lot of hazards for anyone that hasn't ever looked. And that sort of leads me on to the next bit. So it doesn't exist in isolation. It very much forms part of a wider picture. Now, the law itself is a direct legal duty that stands on its own, but it can't be ignored that it's going to overlap with quite a lot of different regulation and legislation that's out there. And for me, I think what will be particularly interesting is the Decent Homes Review when we're seeing that coming in. And as I've already mentioned, there's so much similarity to the housing health and safety rating system. How does it sit against that? And I think we won't know really until we get to that learning phase. Really, it's going to be learning when we hit the ground. But then as well as regulation, there's quite a lot, I would say, in terms of thematic issues that would tie in from everything that we've seen arising from the Grenfell inquiry, not just in terms of building safety, but in particular some of those cultural issues around stigma, around exclusion. And when I first started at CIH, my brief was building safety and asset management, but we've decided to bring culture into that brief because we really feel we won't move forward with any of the building safety or quality improvements unless we address that underlying cultural condition. So that's why we've brought culture in. So I don't want to dwell on this too much, but I do have to acknowledge the fact that it is a very complex piece of legislation, and from the government consultation, but also from a CIH point of view, from our consultation, our member engagement work, we know that the sector faces challenges. And just to reiterate, if there's any confusion, this is a government policy, not a CIH policy, but we are here to try and understand what those challenges are and support members and residents to be able to navigate those to deliver much more safer and quality homes. So in terms of those, I think everybody in the room is probably very aware of what they are, but just as a recap, I would say resources is obviously going to be an issue. Matt mentioned in terms of finance. But I think in terms of skills and the number of surveyors that we're going to have access to across the system, but also the reality of who's going to do the assessment and how's that going to work and all the logistics responding to those quite tight timescales. As I've said, there's quite a lot of overlap. Where's this going to sit in decent homes? Can we use decent homes as a sort of a framework for Awaab's law and building safety to sit under? How does that fit with the existing regulator and the ombudsman? And then for me as well, a lot of the definitions that are used in the law are actually quite complex definitions to unpack. And I'll have a look at that in a minute, whether that be hazard or vulnerability. What does that mean? I think what we've seen from government, that the fact that we are getting a phased hazard approach it shows a recognition of some of those challenges. And I think what we'll be looking for in October is a really strong piece of guidance to accompany that law that brings that clarity and that realism. So having said that, and I'm aware that it's my policy area, and when I go through those challenges, I don't really sell it, do I, as a piece of policy? But I think we really need to see it as an opportunity, as an opportunity to really drive standards forward. But the reality is that we are going to be looking at making quite complex and detailed assessments. But for me, the strength in Awaab's law, one of the strengths in Awaab's law, is that it will look at each tenant's situation very individually, which is hard to do but needs doing. So for example, what a hazard in someone's home might not even be viewed as a hazard to them. It might be a standard repair. And then to use myself as an example, I'm disabled and I have a little boy who's disabled with complex needs. That same hazard might be very different for me, and that might be very, very immediate for me and might cause severe harm or a likelihood of harm. So that's the strength in it, in looking at, okay, well, how do all these different issues affect different people, and then how do we respond in different ways, a much more personalized response. But then also that's a big ask of staff to understand what is vulnerable. How do you say there is a likelihood of harm happening? These are very complex things. So one of the things I've been looking at is a lot of different evidence from public health, from research, from housing practice to understand what is vulnerable, what is a hazard, what is harm. And what I'm trying to do is almost develop a matrix, if you will, an assessment matrix to support providers. And it's not about lowering the standards, but what that's about is, I think, trying to say, how do we act quickly? How do we act proportionately? And how do we make sure that those real risks don't go unrecognised or unmanaged? And I think that's going to be really important when providers and residents could be facing multiple issues at once, either within a household or across a series of households. So I'm aware that all of that bit there is a little bit sometimes a little bit doom and gloom, but I do have to acknowledge the realism. So what I wanted to do was, because we are waiting very patiently for our spending review, and we are waiting very patiently for the guidance to come in October, I wanted to have a look at, right, okay, well, what if we zoom out a little bit and we don't just look at how will we comply legally with Awaab's law. I wanted to look at really holistic approaches that are saying, right, how do we improve safety? How do we improve stock condition? How do we better engage with residents? So some of those issues that really sit behind Awaab's law about raising standards and investing in homes are dealt with in a more holistic approach. And you can probably tell by the accent, I am a touch biased to be introducing what Mr. Burnham is doing up here in the Northwest. But to be fair, there's quite a lot of good things going on. So for anyone that doesn't know, Greater Manchester is a combined authority, and it's adopting what's called a housing first approach. And there's a few different things they're doing, but the two I wanted to highlight was they have had their Social Housing Quality Fund, which is a targeted investment program, and it's funding for social landlords to really tackle some of the biggest issues in terms of the quality of their stock, but especially in relation to damp and mold and cold and safety. And I think it's about 15 or 16 landlords that have had the funding right across Greater Manchester. And one of the good things is it has to be evaluated independently and monitored. And the University of Salford has just done some research about that, and I have put links to everything in the end, and we'll try and drop them in the chat as well. One of the great things that I like about the University of Salford's research, and yes, I hold my hands up, I did graduate from said university, so there's my bias acknowledged. But one of the great things about it is, as well as having a look at all the data behind what's happening with damp and mold, they really wanted to look at the lived experience. So they did a full survey with residents, and they went out into residents' home and interviewed them. What's it like to live with damp and mold? What has your landlord been spending this fund on, and what difference has it made to you? And I think that's really important. And what the research does show is that technology that we're seeing, and there is some amazing technology in terms of remote humidity monitors, predictive analytics, property heat maps. It's all quite amazing. They are going to be essential, I think, in terms of tracking and treating issues like damp and mold, particularly earlier. But I think what the research tells us is that technology must complement and never replace listening to resident realities, because it's the human experience that reveal things like stigma. It's that really tells us the real impact on health and well-being. The other thing that they've been doing in Greater Manchester that I think is a really good idea is the Good Landlord Charter, which, as far as I know, I think is the first of its kind. And what it is a voluntary standard, and it is going to apply to all housing tenures. So it's not just social rent, it cuts right across the board. And what it's trying to do is raise the bar a little bit higher than like a minimum standard for decency. It's trying to say it wants to see landlords going above and beyond. So move my mic out because I think I'm talking too loudly and northernly in it. And they're looking at repairs and safety, but they're also looking at tenant engagement and accountability. And I think this approach here could be something that we could really replicate, that we're showing tenants to we're empowering tenants how they can expect better standards, but really pushing landlords to commit to a higher level of quality. There is a little quote on there that just really sort of hits home in terms of the relationship between damp and mold and health and well-being. But I would definitely encourage anyone to read it. It's quite a comprehensive report. It's really interesting, particularly in terms of looking at practice. And the second example I wanted to highlight was in the West Midlands. So there is a sort of collaborative project between health partners, between third sector partners, and Walsall Housing Group. And this is really looking at how do we tackle some the issues with housing quality and the overlap with sort of health. Because as we know, evidence shows sort of that poor quality housing in terms of damp and mold in particular can really worsen chronic conditions like asthma, and particularly in terms of children, this is a higher risk of other serious health problems. But then has a big sort of knock on in terms of things like school absence and all sort of things that stem from that. So this project isn't about waiting for households to get to a crisis point or waiting for residents to say, I've got a real issue. What it does is it goes into the community, uses a community champion model, and recruits from the tenant communities to go out and proactively support those families. And then they help them sort of navigate asthma care if needed, and housing repairs. And in its first year, they've supported over 90 households, and they've made 18 damp and mold referrals, and they've even sort of rehoused households where that's been needed. So both of those examples, what I really wanted to look at, like I say, rather than necessarily going, how am I going to look at Awaab's law just as I've got to tick these things that I've got to comply with, I wanted to zoom out a little bit and have a look at, okay, well, how do we really tackle some of those issues in terms of quality and decency? In terms of coming back to a policy perspective, so in terms of what would we like to see in October and what would we like to see in the guidance, if I have anybody from Wales with us today, the Welsh Housing Quality Standard is a really clear example of how we can move forward in sort of tenant-centred, health-focused policy. And the guidance that sits with the Housing Quality Standard is very comprehensive. I think it's like 80 odd pages, but it's very clear, very easy to follow, very structured, which would be fantastic for us to see similar in October. And interestingly, it sets out legal duties for social landlords across 6 key areas. So things like safety and decarbonisation are there that you would expect to see. But it also includes digital inclusion and physical and mental well-being, which I think is really interesting. And what it does, rather than say, here are the worst standards, please try to avoid them, it really tries to say, right, okay, let's actively work towards homes that promote not just safety and well-being, but dignity and comfort. And I thought that linked in with what we were seeing in Greater Manchester with the Good Landlord Charter, which is that whole sort of, let's raise the bar. Let's not look at this as compliance. Let's not look at this just as minimum standards. Let's push our expectations of what quality looks like. And I think that really reminds us that the whole goal of our Awaab's law is that much wider piece around safety and quality. So what's become sort of clear to me, not just in terms of my work at the CIH, but I would say right across my whole career, and if anyone's seen me speak before, you will see me speak about this quite a lot, and it is really echoed, in particular, I would say across the Grenfell inquiry reports, is that compliance alone will not be enough. Yes, we absolutely need clear legal duties. Yes, we need enforcement. But from my point of view, we really need to start to change how people are treated, how they're spoken to, how they're listened to, and really recognise that someone's home is a reflection of their worth and their dignity. And as I've said, this is why culture has now been brought in as a key strand of my policy area, because it really overlaps with where we're going to be on professionalisation, competence and conduct, tenant voice, all those different things. So you probably often see me involved in work such as we've been supporting, I can't make any claim for it, but we've been supporting things like Stop Social Housing Stigma. So you may see me talk about stigma and culture quite a lot. I'm working on quite a big research piece on how culture and stigma and safety intersect. And I don't mean that to be sort of all theoretical and academic and conceptual, really everyday practice. How does that show itself in how repairs are logged, how access to property is managed, how residents are spoke to? Because I'm very clear that Awaab's law will not work unless that culture and communication improves alongside policy and process. So having said that, I think that the sector has made huge strides in where it is in terms of both culture, in stock condition and asset management. And I just wanted to sort of pay sort of a moment to acknowledge that. So what's coming next and how are CIH sort of trying to support members as Awaab's law moves forward into implementation. And the caveat, as a huge big part of this, depends on that statutory guidance, which isn't published yet. However, that doesn't mean we're waiting passively. So we're trying to do what we can to unpack some of those challenges. We hosted a Healthy Homes week. We ran a recent Grenfell, which focused on sort of cultural change and trust. This week, I will be doing a fire safety podcast. So we're trying to explore how safety is really part and parcel of housing management, rather than being like the safety guys that do that over here. And just going back to some of that positive work, what we really want to do is gather and publish really practical sort of case studies and examples to show how people are responding to similar challenges, so similar to the GMCA. And then when that final guidance is really released, we will be doing a huge amount of work on that. So whether it be what you need to know, or training, or briefings. I have two communities of practice, which is a group of different practitioners. I have a strategic one, and I have an operational one, and that's my way of staying in touch with what's happening, to understand how I sort of represent that when in my work with government officials. So I can't make a claim to influence policy directly at a government level, but I do always do my best to represent the needs of members and residents in that space. And our goal is to make this law as practical and as grounded but as human as possible, and ensure that everybody feels supported to implement the way that works rather than just complies, if that makes sense. So I think my final thought would be, in terms of before we get into having a conversation, is that I think we need to see it not as a legal opportunity, but a legal obligation, but as an opportunity, not just an opportunity around decency and safety, but an opportunity to continue on that journey we've started on rebuilding trust and really reframing social housing as a human right, if you will, and really sort of coming from a place where a home should always be a place of safety and pride, and never a place of fear and risk. And in case I haven't mentioned it, but I'm quite confident I have, and that it's culture, not just compliance, that will help us close that gap. All my sort of contact details and things on there, and that quote there, you'll have seen me present this if you've seen me present for. It's what my PhD ended on, and it's the quote that I've pinned right up in front of me that gets me out of bed in the morning. So thank you very much for listening to my sort of take on things. I'm really looking forward to your sort of questions and reflections. What I have done at the end of the slides is everything that I've talked about today, whether it be a piece of legislation, a research, CIH training. I have dropped it into here, and when you go in, you'll just click on the links, but I can drop some of those into the chat as well.
Thank you very, very much, Eve, and I really, really appreciate thoroughly. It's very difficult sometimes to encompass everything there in 20 minutes, and I think you've given a really kind of a helicopter overview of exactly where we are. And you'll have probably noticed the chat hasn't in any way, shape, or form slowed down. It's been a very, very busy chat while you've been sharing. So what I will do is I'll make sure obviously the slides get shared round, and then anybody who wants any of those kind of specific reports can follow up on them. Are you okay if I go to full screen, Eve? Is that okay with you? Excellent. So I'm just going to do that one. Right. So a few of the points that have come up in the chat that I'm just going to kind of raise. One point which came up from Alex. What I will say is, if anybody, regardless if you put something in the chat or not, if you wish to, do use the React. There's a little arrow next to React to the bottom of the screen, and you can raise your hand, and then I will happily bring you in if you wish to be brought in. The Housing Ombudsman had a few focus groups a few weeks ago asking us what we thought should be added. A big one was adequate insulation when retrofit is utilised for the race to net zero. ASB and general investment were also mentioned. Do you think a lot of this is going to be changed as we move through? Do you think some of this could be added later, or do you think this is kind of just where we are for now? Alert Call return as one of the keynote sponsors for the Social Housing Roundtable in 2025 into 2026, and we're delighted to have them back. Alertical will help as many people as possible feel safe, connected and informed by combining ingenious technology and award-winning human contact. As you can see from this touchscreen I've got with me, Alertical's digital engagement solution helps social landlords proactively know their customers and properties by putting a portable touchscreen in every home, offering a daily property check through the optional OK Each Day service, plus repairs reporting, tenant surveys and much more. They also provide Beyond Warden Call, an easier, simpler and lower cost wireless warden call solution with video door entry, dispersed telecare and smoke alarms. Alertical work with over 60 housing providers across the UK to enhance two-way engagement between customers and their landlords. In 2022, Alertical won the Queen's Award for Enterprise and Innovation, and in 2023, Alertical won Housing Supplier of the Year. We're delighted to have them back with us throughout the course of this year, and please do go check them out on social media and LinkedIn to find out more. Thank you very much, Alertical, for sponsoring us again. Case Management Solution Group, or CMSG, are the home of React, the UK's #1 case management system for ASB and community safety. We are delighted to have them as one of our key sponsors for Social Housing Roundtable 2025 into 2026. And with the ASB app now fully integrated to the platform, it allows residents to record, monitor and report issues directly to their case office in live time. What's not to love? CMSG are bringing simplicity back to case management, and I cannot recommend them enough and thank them for all of their support through this period and through the rest of the year. Thank you, CMSG, and do please go check them out on social media and on LinkedIn. Thank you.
I think, as far as I understand it, we'll start with damp and mold and excess cold in October, and then we will bring in not me, the government will bring in the rest. I think that the guidance is still being developed, so I think we are waiting to see what kind of tier we'll bring those in. This is only my personal opinion, I would expect to see the ones that are more directly related to a landlord's control come in first, or some of those ones around excess temperature and things like ASB and structural property issues. I would expect them to come in first. But yeah, and I think part of it is also that learning phase. I think there is going to be a lot to be learned when it's legal. I think there are going to be cases in court, and I have seen some of the legal things raised in the chat there that we'll get to, and I think that's the reality of we need to be able to see. For me, there's a huge overlap there between, and that's why I was trying to have a look at projects that are helping make safer, warmer homes, because they then in themselves address that, because a well heated, ventilated home really helps cut down damp and mold. So for anyone that doesn't know my colleague, Dr. Matthew Scott, and you don't have to be a doctor to join the CIH, just so we're being very clear on that. It's just sort of a weird coincidence that we both are. He covers very much net zero and decarbonisation and retrofitting. So we're going to have a look together, particularly under Decent Homes. I think Decent Homes has the potential to be a great framework to pull this together. So we're going to have a look at, okay, well, where's the overlap here in terms of policy? Are the right sort of teams speaking to each other in government? Are the right people working together? And how do we tie that together? So we're definitely trying to pull that together. And we were very clear on that in terms of our asks for the spending review. I'll tell you how close we got to that when the spending review comes out.
Thank you very much. Alex, I'll bring you in because obviously that was your question that's just been responded to there via Eve. You've still got your mute at the moment, Alex. There we are, lovely.
Yeah, I just think, I mean, the focus groups, I think it was just 75 people from the Housing Quality Resident Panel. And it broke out into 5 different groups. And the main things that came up in the group I was in was that the race for net zero seems unattainable anyway, and it's like places are being fitted with air source heat pumps and they're just not adequately insulated for ambient heat. The other was ASB and controlling ASB, and how can a landlord control ASB when half the properties on a scheme may have been sold off in the 80s and 90s in the right to buy, and things like that. So there's a lot of thought, a lot of things to think about were given to the Ombudsman a few weeks ago, but the biggest ones were about net zero, insulation and ASB.
Yeah, and part of our work in terms of how we work with officials and the consultation that was open before the law itself was finalised is being very clear about some of the challenges in terms of that. And that piece of work that I mentioned very briefly, the sort of matrix, I don't know why I keep doing that. It's because I do, because it's a square when I think about it, like a and I think deliverability's got to be in there in terms of what is realistically in a landlord's control. An ASB is a really complex example. I will not go down the right to buy, but that's another round table, that Matt, isn't it? That in terms of the issues that's caused. But yeah, there are going to be issues that are not necessarily outside of a landlord's control, but not wholly in their control. That it's going to be really challenging. I think some of the wording in the law is about reasonableness and reasonable steps that have been taken. And again, I think that's an area that in the guidance we would like to see some clarity on. What does that really mean, so that we are balancing what is achievable for a landlord, but ensuring that residents are getting the service and the support that they would expect from the landlord. Yeah, so a lot of it is sort of waiting to see how that guidance, what that guidance looks like, and how that's shaped and working through that. Yeah.
And that's what I think some of the points that come up in the chat was around that. I think as Judith has said, when is the housing sector in general going to ask the government for plain English law instead of legalese and drafter speak? And so much of these, again, I think that's come up, which is, I think Judith had mentioned a point around what the term vulnerable means is different for everybody. And I think there's a lot of things in there, again, where we're going, well, actually, that can be completely kind of decided upon yourself in terms of what these actually mean. And that isn't useful for landlords or for tenants. Daisy, I'm going to bring you in. Lovely to have you with us today.
Thank you. I can assure you I'm not driving. I am travelling though. I just wanted to say that as the G15 residents group, we actually worked with the Ministry of Housing on the guidance last week, which is obviously really good way step forward, because they're actually listening to a group of residents to inform their guidance. Some of the takeaways from that, which was really important, were to ensure that the examples that they were giving were really clear. We discussed some of the examples that they'd actually drafted up, and whether they gave an example where the tiles had been replaced by the resident, and that then wouldn't be applicable if they were broken Awaab's law. So there's lots of detail that needs to be really, really clear for everyone to absolutely understand what their rights are.
Sorry, Daisy, we're starting to lose you there, Daisy.
The other thing that they have that information so that they're clear. Hear me?
Sorry, Daisy, we're losing you there, unfortunately, with the signal. But I think we got most of that first point. Eve, did you have any thoughts on it at all?
Yeah,
I just wanted to ask one question, which was: is the housing ombudsman going to be given the same time restrictions that the landlords are, to make sure that any complaints are timely?
I think I've got the gist of
that.
Obviously, I don't know in terms of a few things to pick up there. I think what I will say in terms of developing the guidance and the implementation, I have seen a lot of engagement from government officials with a wide range of stakeholders. I think Daisy was just talking there about a tenant group there, but I believe TPAS also hosted a session. So I think they are really working on very detailed guidance to really sort of break that down and say, in this case and in that case. And I know that there'll be a lot of work from ourselves, from TPAS, from the National Housing Federation to really make sense of it and support that. With the Ombudsman, I don't have an inside track there on that, but I think I share some of the frustration maybe that what Daisy was saying. Having gone through a different process, but very similar with the local care Ombudsman, I can really sympathise. There's some real delays, I think, with all ombudsmans. Do we need an ombudsman of ombudsmans? I think that's something that they're up against, and I do know that you can see that they're trying to recruit and get through that the best they can, but I don't know about any plans in terms of statutory sort of timescales for the ombudsman themselves.
Thank you, Eve. There's a few points I want to go to in the chat, but Alicia, I noticed, had raised a number of them, and she's put her hand up. So Alicia, we'd love to welcome you onto the platform. I think we've still got you on mute. There we are, lovely.
It was nothing to do with anything I've said in the chat. I did tell you, Matt, you wouldn't shut me up on this one. It's to agree something totally with what Eve said, and it's at the heart of the issues. Reasonableness means something different to every single person. It's meaningless, and the problem is that we're getting this thing where everyone seems almost frightened to come out, and what we need is just a clear set of rules. I use the HHSRS and the Decent Home Standard every week, helping tenants already to get proper repair requests done, followed by complaints if necessary. And unfortunately, the big issue is, and I hate to say it because I am a tenant, there is still, the majority of tenants still don't understand their rights, and they don't understand what is reasonable. They don't understand what they can expect of their landlords. And so it's something, and groups like this, we really need for informed tenants who have already got the information to be talking more like this, exactly like this, so that we together work to get an understanding of what exactly needs to be done. I'm a member of the HOS tenant panel, along with several other tenants on here, and I've asked them. I'm also a TPAS scrutineer, and I've asked them for information about the 80% of inquiries and complaints that go through to the HOS, which they can't deal with. That something is going very, very wrong. And all that Awaab's law is going to do is make the situation even worse. Something is missing. And it is a lot of it is with direct communication. It's being able to say to tenants, and I have to say it sometimes, this isn't something that there's going to be any point you complaining with HOS. It's about understanding that just because your kitchen's 10 years old doesn't mean you're going to get a new kitchen, because it's not part of what's in the Decent Law Standard. So I just ask that we all kind of come together and get just one point or one set of rules that we can all begin to work with, because it's the only way, while we're all working these different in our own little silos, we're not going to get one set of rules for the majority of tenants who still don't know what the situation is. And I will shut up now, Matt.
You don't need to at all. And I think what's interesting, and what you've clearly made in the points you've made in the chat and others, it isn't that, as sometimes gets heard, tenants need more rights, tenants need this, tenants need this. It's actually understanding the law, understanding where things are from both sides. Because if you've put in the chat there are obviously going to be more rogue traders, for want of a better term, people coming out trying to go, hey, look, don't do that, just do what we do and we'll earn you money and we'll do this and we'll do those kind of things, as you've put in the chat. But part of what you've put in there is actually refusing entry to your landlord isn't going to get you anywhere, but that's what people are being told on the other side. And there is a relationship breakdown that absolutely needs fixing. I mean, Sue Healy's raised in the chat there, I'm fearful that the minimum standard may be the same for some providers as the default standard. And I think, unfortunately, that's going to be true, because on one side, some businesses will just see that and go, right, that's what we have to do. And I'm not saying that's a good thing or a bad thing, I'm saying that's where it will be. But on the other side, that's just all that's going to be affordable. And as someone who's the chair of a very small housing provider, I can tell you, we have been for years working to the close penny, the close pound, making things work and getting it right. the laws coming in are genuinely, it's a huge financial burden. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. There is an absolute need for the law to change, for things to get better, and for stuff like ours, for what happened with our Bish Act to never happen again, and for owners to be there and something in legislation. That doesn't mean that it's always going to be affordable in every single onus of it. And what that looks like, as Alicia's pointed out, when it comes down to terms like reasonable or vulnerable or whatever these terms might mean, they're so subjective. It makes things really difficult. There's been a point made by Samantha in the chat. From our perspective, how can we empower and engage more residents so they're more well informed about the changes? Alicia, that was actually
I think she's the worst wrestler they have. Well, before we get into night 2,
what is going on here? Apologies, that was my laptop going wild. But Alicia, that one was actually aimed at you in terms of how can we empower and engage more residents so they're well informed about the changes. But I mean, Eve as well and Alicia, I mean, your thoughts on this? I guess more generally is how do we get the right information out when I guess the information is still a bit subjective? It seems to be the general theme around this. And Eve, have you heard, before I go back to Alicia, have you heard anything on this in terms of, you know, when trying to speak with government or those putting the policy in about any changes that might be coming or how that's being heard by government, I guess?
Yeah, we've been very clear on that, and I think several other, you know, not just us at the CIH, I think several other bodies that have represented the sector have been very clear, because they're a level. It's not just that we've got vulnerability and then we've got reasonableness and we've got severity of harm, likelihood of harm, priority. It's the fact that they've all got to sit together, and I think that some of the concerns have been that that's also a huge judgment for a staff member to make in that moment, and some of those terms feel very medical, although there won't be any medical evidence required under Awaab's law, and I think that's a bit of uncertainty for staff as well, in terms of how on earth am I, you know, going to be equipped to sit and make this decision, that, you know. So that's the matrix that I'm working on, and what I'm trying to do is draw from examples that already, whether it be health or whether it be in other sectors, that already have working definitions of those, and apply those definitions, so that like Alicia was just saying, so that I wouldn't want to call them rules because we don't write the policy, but at least a clear set of guidance that we can say, right, okay, this is what likelihood of harm, you know, looks like on a scale, and this is where it sits. And I do think that government have been listening on that, and I would expect to see that in the guidance, to see it quite comprehensively laid out in terms of, as Daisy was just saying, different scenarios of what it really looks like. And as I understand it, they will be developing 2 sets of guidance, one for providers to implement the law, and then one for residents as well. But I do think that learning phase that we're going to see is that there is a reality that we have to see what this looks like. Yes, I feel like I'm not responding quickly enough to the chat. It would be great to do so, but it's in that Sue had sort of seen, yes, that piece of work on that matrix. I've been doing quite a lot of work on that, and yes, I would love feedback on that. But I have used some of the ombudsman data in terms of what a priority. But yeah, one of the strands in that is, what is a priority for residents, you know, and understanding which of the hazards you care about against that. Yes.
I think you in the chat, I mean, there was something which had come up. So Tim had said, I agree with your point about culture, Eve, but how do you educate people to understand what to do and not to do when living in their homes? Being humans, we all have different levels of understanding when dealing with humidity in domestic environments. And I'm tying this in with a couple of other points, but one in particular that caused almost a sub-thread on the chat today, which was from Brian, said, do you agree that the major key is going to be knowing your tenants' residents as well as knowing the properties? Without a full picture of this, there will be an inability to comply, which was then, I guess, questioned in a positive way by Judah, saying that's absolutely great, but don't then use that as an excuse to go and get every bit of data about every single thing, because that isn't necessarily what you need. So that piece which we struggled with for years, and there's a different chat around Grenfell, which I'll come back to, but as Sue has pointed out, the trouble with the legal route on so much of this is the sheer number of cases already in the court backlog. And when we're adding on and when we're going through so many of the points we've got here regarding how well do we know our tenants? How well do we know our homes? How well do we really know exactly what's going on behind the door? Right. Well, where does that sit in one of these three things? Because they're going to move all the time. They can change overnight, etc. This has been the biggest challenge of housing for years. But on the other side of it, this is also exactly why we're stuck where we are, because there's no easy fixes, no easy answers to any of this.
Yeah, and I think that data is huge. And to come back on Ryan's point in terms of some of the work, so the knowing our homes work by the NatFed, and we've been working on a project called Rethinking Repairs. That data it is vital to really understand it. And as I've said, there's some fantastic technology that adds layers of amazing data that you can throw on top of that. But then I agree with I think it was Judith that made the point. I think it's about striking the balance to having data and keeping up to date on that data, but not reducing residents' experiences of their home right down to data points all the time, because I think that's where we have the gaps, and we see the issues in terms of
The empathy and the training and everything else.
Yeah, making judgments. Everyone's got to live in a home. Everyone's got to do the washing and have a bath, and and I think we've got to strike that balance between tracking and understanding health and hazards, and like someone said, supporting people to live well in their homes and look after their homes, but then just strike a balance there about you don't want to end up in a situation, do you, where someone's like, you had a bath today. We don't want to end up in that situation. We want to use the data wisely against listening to residents
and understanding why the homes aren't fit for purpose in the way that unfortunately.
That's it.
Now, so you can see a point from James in the chat, which said all of this has already been agreed in the phase 2 report. If people are able to read the information available on there isn't loads new. Just look at the new fire regs and the PEEPs. And I agree, but the challenge there, as you'll know yourself, James, is sometimes there's so much information coming out that actually trying to find the right bit for you on any one day is a challenge. And also people have got, I think, frustrated over the years of going, okay, there's this new piece of legislation come out, that's going to fix everything. Okay, great, well, I'll learn that, and then nothing changes, so they don't bother reading the next one. And eventually people burn out from that, and so that balance between the two is really hard, which is why I'm really grateful for Eve coming on today. There was a question which had come through from Grant. Hi, Eve, my question, has there been any research with how the rest of Europe, which is obviously colder, deal with damp and mold, and what are the findings? I don't know if that's something we can cover too much today, because obviously that's almost another roundtable unto itself. But is there any kind of acknowledgement of maybe what's going on elsewhere in the world that has been used to fuel this legislation at all?
Yeah, and I could do a series of roundtables on housing research across Europe. It's the kind of thing I read for fun. So yeah, that's something I have been looking at. What I have looked at across Europe is an approach called a living lab, which has been used in Europe, particularly in terms of decarbonisation and retrofit. But I would love to see taken a bit wider, which is basically like a huge, big sort of living practice network, where you would have researchers, you would have counsellors, you would have scientific experts on damp, and then you would have residents that live in it, and really sort of that learning phase of, right, okay, let's see how this works. And I think that's something that I would definitely be interested in. And then strangely enough, in a couple of weeks, courtesy of the National Housing Maintenance Fund, I'll be going to Berlin to look at the way in which German social housing manages its assets and retrofitting. So that's something I'm really hoping to pick up from there in terms of learning how they do it.
And we're going into the last few minutes. I'm going to try and do kind of a whistle-stop tour of some of the questions and points in the chat, because otherwise we will run over, and I'm trying desperately not to. So James has said that, so Alex said, with regard to Grenfell, my landlord has carried out personal emergency evacuation plans for the residents in our high-rises, which is great to hear, because I know there was a point made earlier on around the fault of Grenfell and what the cladding and everything else that came around it. And obviously that's more vital. Obviously, it's slightly separate to damp and mold side, but it's almost another session unto itself. So I'm going to have to kind of fly past it a little bit. Please don't think I'm ignoring you for raising it in the first place. James has said, my worry is the Ombudsman is encroaching on the regulator's terms of reference. And one more thing, has not Awaab's law got royal assent already? Is it already law? I guess there's a question around that, which I'll fly back to in a moment. Nick, we've just received a Demian, I'm not sure what the word was, which is delayed by 4 months. They forgot to send us the letter out, maladministration in action. After we asked for a review, the entire process took in excess of 18 months, and the Housing Ombudsman averred in law in the decision, which I think just shows you how long some of these things are taking. Sue, it's not only about knowing your tenants, but many tenants wouldn't think they're vulnerabilities, but they may have, but hate the terminology, so they won't engage. Absolutely fine. Again, that comes into that stigmatization piece. Alex has said our customer voice group have regular events online, and these have grown in popularity, which is wonderful to hear. During these meetings, we will take on board concerns and take action, but also direct people to groups where they can find out about plans and budgets. And this, again, is about pushing the narrative out there. And Harriet, I'm going to people who we haven't heard loads from. So there's a point which went directly. Tenants should attend the 4 Million Homes event. Absolutely agree. But Harriet had said in Worcestershire, we've been working with our GPs to try and share social housing stock data into the primary care networks to highlight individuals with certain long-term conditions and prioritise remedial work required to their homes. Goodness me, the chat is going on. I think there's an awful lot happening there that I'm never going to get a chance to cover in the last kind of couple of minutes that we've got. But just on one of the questions that did come through, royal assent, where are we with it in that process, Eve?
So Awaab's law is covered under Section 10 of the Social Housing Regulation Act 2023, and it is that Social Housing Act itself that has received royal assent. So technically, but yeah, so it's very complicated, legally very complicated, but Awaab's law as a section of that has not yet come into force and does not come into force until October, but the wider act has received royal assent, yeah.
And you can see that James has said it's funny that there are regs on gas and electric, etc., but no regs on how high relative humidity levels can be, which is a large driver of the health issues related. And I think that's, again, one of the big problems and concerns with this is that are we regulating the right bits, and is the regulation clear? Seems to again be unfortunately where we're finding ourselves, which is frustrating. Paula said, have providers started adapting their responsive repairs process to incorporate necessary changes? From those I've spoken with, they are, and they're doing their best, but I think it's just starting to dawn how expensive some of this is going to be, and also how many problems there are with the supply chain. It's all well and good going, okay, well, we need to do all of this and we need to respond in 24 hours, etc. We don't have the staff and we don't have the levels of staff we need, and that isn't going to fix in 6 months. That alone is going to be a huge, huge problem. And I don't know whether, Eve, you're hearing anything more on that at all?
No, just that those are the concerns there. So I think I've seen a few people talking about how we bring in health there. I've just written a chapter in a book for social workers, of all things, to try and understand why health and housing needs to strongly come under social work, because I think some of these wider issues can't always completely just be for the sector to deal with on their own. And the other thing I had seen, I do know that there are a lot of concerns about, how do I word this, less than scrupulous legal practice that may take advantage of residents with disrepair in their home. That is something that has been very clearly communicated to government officials, and there is work going on about that. I went to a working group on Monday about alternative dispute resolution that's really trying to set a standard around how do we balance making sure residents have full right to legal redress, but we don't get in a situation where people are being exploited through that legal process. So just to reassure people that we do recognise that there are concerns there, and we are working in that area as well.
Thank you very, very much. We're going down to the last 30 seconds. So Eve, just any kind of final thoughts you'd like to share with the group before I kind of bring today's session to an end?
No, just the recognition that it is a broad, complex piece, but that very much that's what I get out of bed for, and that is what I am absolutely committed to do, and to see that quality and that safety of homes improve in a realistic and human way.
Jim, I would have brought you in, but we're literally out of time. We'll have to do that one next time. Sorry, it's a little bit late. But as I say, there's no roundtable next week. There will be one the week after where we'll be discussing a very different subject around KAM, so knowledge and information management. And we're going to be doing that with Big Picture Training and Claire Patterson, who are coming to the table in a couple of weeks' time. But for today, Eve, a huge, huge thank you to you for the session, for bringing that to the table today. I agree. A lot of people have said we need more time on the subject. We're finding that every week at the moment. But please do with Eve on LinkedIn or follow it via myself. We'll have some slides if you're not on the mailing list that I can share out, etc. But for now, thank you very much, Eve, and I'll look forward to catching up with you all soon. Take care. Thanks, Eve.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.